Bavaria has many castles, but only 3 of them are called fairy tale castles. The man who had these castles built, Ludwig II, was looked upon by his contemporaries as something of an eccentric. He lived in a world of art and imagination, but led a lonely life and died a lonely death.
Oh, doesn't it?
Oh, what?
Alles offen, darum ist schon alles so verfault.
Ja, da hockt alles rein.
Genau, da läuft das Wasser nicht.
Copper is a durable material, but the castle called Neuschwanstein, which is roofed with copper, began to need a new roof about 100 years after it was erected. The contract was awarded to a very small firm, 3 Bavarian roofers who were also mountain climbers. They planned to repair the roof mountain climber style, that is, using only ropes and ladders, entirely without clumsy, ugly scaffolding. It was the kind of job that a roofer could only dream of. For 15 years, the 3 men worked on the roof of Neuschwanstein Castle, high above the valley in one of Bavaria's most beautiful locations. It was, however, a rather daring undertaking that combined the ecstasy of high altitudes with the risks of a catastrophic fall. The future would bring similar thrills and similar dangers to the king who built that castle, the Dream King. The fairy tale king. All of us have such dreams, to ascend high above everything, to withdraw to an impregnable fortress, to shut the gates, to feel safe and unassailable. He had this kind of fortress right from the beginning. All of us dream about unspoiled nature, about a peaceful country of mountains and lakes. He had all this at his disposal, a land more beautiful than words can describe. All of us dream about an island, about living in a secluded paradise, in a castle. He could buy whatever island and build whatever castle his heart desired. He was born in a beautiful castle. He was descended from a highly respected family, surrounded by accommodating servants all his life. He was the center of attention. He was rich. He was powerful. He was the king. Ludwig II von Wittelsbach, King of Bavaria by the grace of God. Ludwig was only 18 years old when he ascended the throne in 1864, but he had all the royal qualities that one hoped for in a king. More than 6 feet tall, slender, stately, and according to eyewitness reports, he was also enchantingly handsome. At first, he did everything he could to be a good king. Bavaria at this time was no longer an absolute monarchy. Now that there was a constitution, the king's powers were limited. But he was by no means a mere figurehead like our present-day monarchs. Ludwig II reigned and governed. No law could be enacted without his signature. He performed all the functions that were expected of a king. He gave receptions, made public appearances, but curiously enough, he seemed to derive no pleasure from the enthusiastic tributes rendered him by his loyal subjects. Ludwig II had little interest in military affairs. He was repulsed by the Prussians and by the saber-rattling enthusiasm for war that was then spreading throughout Germany. But it was not so much his aversion to all things military that kept him from participating in parades and maneuvers. Rather, it was a shyness he felt in the presence of large masses of people, a strong sense of awkwardness which he felt when approached by self-confident individuals. Not only the officers in his army noticed the young king's peculiar behavior. His ministers and other court officials began to take notice too. More and more, Ludwig II shunned his royal residence in Munich and preferred to pass the time at his rural castles and mountain huts instead. Other peculiarities also began to attract attention. The restless look in his eyes, the frequent and unpredictable changes in his mood, an extreme restlessness, and an exaggerated theatricality. Still more astonishing was the young king's disinterest in the fairer sex, a world of elegant ladies which would have seemed to be his for the taking. Of the court ballet, wrote the Austrian envoy in a letter to Vienna, of the court ballet thus far only the stage sets have found their way into the royal bedroom. It was hoped that an energetic young wife would bring the king to his senses. A suitable candidate soon appeared, Ludwig's own cousin Sophie, younger sister of the Austrian Empress Elizabeth, the famous Sissi. Ludwig and Sophie even went as far as announcing their engagement. But half a year later, Ludwig would have nothing more to do with his fiancée, and the wedding was called off. What was the problem with this radiant young king, with this fairy tale youth who had seemed so enchanting? Ludwig had been an unusually lovable child. As was customary among the higher ranks of the nobility at that time, as an infant he had been entrusted to the care of a wet nurse. When he was 8 months old, however, Ludwig's nurse died suddenly. The loss of this caregiver during Ludwig's infancy was the first catastrophe in his young life, and was the decisive event responsible for his later inability to form normal relationships with people. He had never been especially close with his mother, but this too was typical among the nobility of that era. Little Ludwig and his younger brother Otto were not raised by their parents, but by nannies, instructors, and tutors. It was a prince's court within the king's court, devoted solely to them. Ludwig's father, Max II, played no great role in his son's upbringing, and just when the young crown prince desperately needed a father's presence, Max II died. This early death of his father was the second catastrophe in Ludwig's life. Ludwig spent much of his youth at Hohenschwangau Castle, which his father had built upon the ruins of an ancient knight's castle. This castle and its surroundings made a lifelong impression on Ludwig, endowed him with his love for nature, for the Bavarian mountains, and the medieval world. The castle's rooms were filled with paintings depicting stories from the Middle Ages. Ludwig's imagination came alive in these stories, in this fairy tale world of noble heroes and courageous knights. Not only was he constantly surrounded by them, he also felt himself to be part of them, since his own forefathers had belonged to this world and looked down upon it from these very walls. When his father died, Ludwig moved into the late king's bedroom at Hohenschwangau and called in stage designers from his court theater to refurnish the bedroom's interior. Here in this room, we can find many of the props which we'll meet again in his castles. 2 young orange trees, a small grotto with a fountain, a bedside rug with a swan motif, and on the walls, illustrations from one of the stories that he loved so much at Hohenschwangau, the tale of Rinaldo and Armida. Rinaldo, a crusader and nobleman, is seduced by the beautiful sorceress Armida. In her magical garden, he enjoys all of love's pleasures and forgets his noble duties. Fortunately, Rinaldo has faithful friends who hasten to rescue him. The friends resist the seductive arts of Armida's beautiful companions, who try to distract them from their task. The friends show Rinaldo the mirror of virtue. He gazes into the glass, is reminded of his holy duties, and returns to the noble world of men. When Ludwig moved into his father's bedroom, he ordered the pictures of seductive women to be covered, and had the bed placed in such a way that his gaze was constantly directed toward the conscientious hero, Rinaldo. He also had the ceiling painted dark blue and studded with stars. Craftsmen from his court theater installed these stars so that they could be illuminated at night from the upper story. Ever since his earliest childhood, Ludwig had always been terribly afraid of the dark. The bedroom at Hohenschwangau was the first room that Ludwig furnished according to his own taste, the taste of an idealistically minded young man who lived in a fantasy world of noble heroes. Ludwig was familiar with this heroic world from many productions that he had seen staged at the court theater in Munich. Tannhäuser was very much a part of this world. Here again we have a similar story. The noble medieval Minnesinger, Tannhäuser, is sorely tempted by Lady Venus. He almost succumbs to her charms, but at the last moment he recalls his ideals and duties and finally finds redemption in the love for a saint, a pure love this time. The great composer, Richard Wagner, had set this ardent young man's story of beautiful virgins, pure love, and holy duties in a musical composition that affected many of its listeners almost like an intoxicating drug. Ludwig had attended performances of Wagner's operas Lohengrin and Tannhäuser as a 16- and 17-year-old, and he was enraptured. Richard Wagner became his idol, yet it was precisely this immoderate admiration that led directly to the third catastrophe in Ludwig's life. In the development of every young man, there comes a time when he searches for a role model upon whom he projects all the ideals of his youth. In the normal course of development, this role model remains unattainable, and sometimes gently, sometimes with a painful thud, the young man finds his way down from the heights of his lofty ideals and returns to reality. When Ludwig ascended the throne at the age of 18, however, his royal status meant that he could simply summon the ideal of his youth to appear before him. And Richard Wagner, who was not entirely free of self-interest, was hardly eager to help the youthful king return to the mundane world of reality. Instead, he only affirmed the young king's passionate enthusiasm and fantastic notions. Wagner won himself an extremely generous patron, but he also prevented the youthful king from ever growing up. All his life, Ludwig II would remain an idealistic and wildly enthusiastic youth. Only in the light of this background can one understand Ludwig's life, the buildings he constructed, and his inability to cope with a reality that didn't live up to his ideals. The young king remained caught up in the illusory world of paintings, books, and the theater. The older he got, the more unwilling he became to leave this ideal world of art and imagination. Rather than forsake his imaginary world, he decided to give it concrete form through architecture. All of Ludwig's buildings are like pieces of stage scenery that have been eternalized in stone. The first drafts of plans for Neuschwanstein Castle were drawn by set designers from his court theater, the same men who had designed the scenery for Ludwig's beloved productions of Tannhäuser and Lohengrin. From the beginning, Neuschwanstein was meant as a monument to the rapturously idolized composer Richard Wagner, and as a real-life setting for Wagner's operas. Ludwig was 22 years old when he decided to build Neuschwanstein. At first, he had wanted a small knight's stronghold, then changed his mind and yearned for a larger castle in the Romanesque style. But he wanted his Romanesque knight's castle to also be romantic, and poetic, and picturesque, just like his own idealized image of the Middle Ages. Every detail of the interiors was designed to remind him of Richard Wagner's dramatic works. Every hall, every room in the suite of private apartments was furnished and decorated like a live-in stage set for a Wagnerian opera. For example, the large Knight's Hall was meant to recall the Singers' Hall in the opera Tannhäuser, where the famous singing duel between medieval minnesingers had been fought. When the king left the Singers' Hall and entered his study, the scene from the singers' duel was painted on the wall in front of him. Beside it was the scene from Venusberg, which we've already seen, the enchanted Tannhäuser languishing in the grotto of the love goddess Venus. And then, the end of the story, Tannhäuser in Rome, repenting his sins at the feet of the Pope. As Ludwig sat in his study, these images were constantly in view. And on his desk, he even had a gilded statuette of his favorite hero, Lohengrin, wearing chainmail, a cape, and a swan helmet, just the way Ludwig imagined his ideal hero. As far as details were concerned, Ludwig frequently insisted on the utmost historical precision. But in general, he wasn't all that interested in stylistic consistency, and freely juxtaposed Romanesque, Gothic, Byzantine, and Renaissance elements without regard for historical authenticity. Ludwig ordered his bedroom furnished in the Gothic style, the style he had first known at Hohenschwangau, the castle of his youth. But here too, he didn't want pure Gothic, but only yearned to see his own ideas of a Gothic interior realized, in a style that would be even more Gothic than the original one. More rich, more filigreed, more sublime, an ideal Gothic, so to speak. It took 17 woodcutters more than 4 years' work to hand-carve this bed. Originally, the young king had hoped that 3 years' construction would suffice. Then he could reside in his new knight's castle and receive Richard Wagner as his guest. But in fact, 11 years lay between the day the cornerstone was laid and the first day when he was able to occupy provisionally completed rooms at Neuschwanstein. His private apartments weren't finished enough to allow him to move in until 4 years before his death. For King Ludwig, wonderful Neuschwanstein Castle was always just an enormous construction site. Ludwig was forever calling for changes and alterations in the plans, thus creating further delays in the castle's construction. As he grew older, he became more and more enthusiastic about Wagner's final opera, Parsifal. Consequently, he ordered the construction of this awe-inspiring throne room, which was to be dedicated to the pure hero, Parsifal, and to the idea of a holy, divinely blessed monarchy, a notion about monarchy which was identical with Ludwig's own ideal. As a young man, Ludwig was an uncommonly strong horseman. His rides tended toward the extreme, both in their frequency and in their length. 30 miles around Lake Starnberg, 80 miles from Munich to Innsbruck. Riding helped him cope with his inner unrest and with the anxieties that tormented him. Every year, beginning in mid-May, Ludwig undertook extended tours in the mountains. He traveled to various mountain huts and hunters' lodges, following travel plans which had been made beforehand with painstaking exactitude. More than 100 people worked in his royal stables. Just for his outings in the mountains, Ludwig had 30 English thoroughbred horses kept in constant readiness. Columns of porters went on ahead to prepare the huts for the royal visit. After all, even in the most remote mountain hut, Ludwig insisted on being served 12-course banquets. In 1871, the German Reich was founded, and Bavaria lost its sovereignty. It was around this time that the king began to eat excessively. He gained weight, and by the time he had reached nearly 300 pounds, he was no longer able to ride a horse. After this, he rode to the mountains in a special one-axled wagon. It was at this time that he began to furnish one of his mountain huts in an extremely luxurious style. It was the so-called King's House on the Schachen, near Garmisch-Partenkirchen in the Bavarian Alps. Beginning in 1876, he came here each year in August to spend his birthday. He insisted upon being driven up to Schachen during the night. When he arrived at dawn, the house had to be illuminated and fireworks had to be launched. Even if he arrived after daybreak and the morning skies were already bright, he always insisted on having his fireworks. Rituals like these were a fixation for him. Inside the house, a salon in the Moorish style awaited him. This style allowed him to play the role of an oriental potentate for a few days. Downstairs, he could make himself comfortable in a Bavarian pinewood parlor. If one knows Ludwig II only from the castles he had built, one doesn't know him very well. Buildings were only one of his passions. He had several others. For example, he had a special liking for the greatest mechanical toy of his era, the railroad. He had already inherited a special royal train from his father, but this train wasn't regal enough for him. Just 3 years after his coronation, Ludwig ordered the train's salon car to be rebuilt and refurnished according to his own specifications. At that time, a salon car was regarded as a kind of residence on wheels. This rolling residence included a study, which we see here, a lounge, the actual salon, and a sleeping compartment with 2 beds and a washroom. At Ludwig's behest, this car was transformed into a rolling Rococo palace, complete with all the decorations and gold ornaments appropriate to the Rococo style. Once again, the king had created a stage set which allowed him to play the role of an absolute monarch, at least temporarily and in his own fantasies. It was a role he loved, but could never actually live in real life. Curiously enough, he used his magnificent royal train only a very few times for official trips. Occasionally, he made it available to guests of state, as was customary at that time. And once, he lent it to his cousin, the Austrian Empress Elizabeth, or Sissi, whom he especially admired. One of the king's most eccentric passions was his love for old carriages. This passion was so exaggerated that it had to be kept secret, and that was quite a feat in an era when people were accustomed to many extravagances in the lifestyles of their ruling princes. Ludwig ordered 2 gold-encrusted Baroque coaches to be rebuilt and rode in them secretly through remote mountain valleys. This one is only the smaller of the 2 gala coaches. When he rode in the larger one, which was drawn by a team of 8 horses, the king was flanked by 16 grooms in custom-tailored Rococo costumes, 8 on his left and 8 on his right. Not only did he love the pageantry of carriage riding, he also relished the exhilaration of riding fast during his midnight drives in golden carriages. He owned the world's first vehicle equipped with electric lighting, a special construction designed by his theater technicians. He made such a profound impression on Bavarian mountain farmers as he raced by night through snowy alpine valleys in a glowing sleigh that it's easy to understand why he soon earned his nickname, the Fairy Tale King. Ludwig's gala carriages and splendid sleighs lead us into an era in which the king felt just as at home as in the Middle Ages and in the world of the Wagnerian opera heroes, namely, the era of France's Baroque and Rococo kings, the age of Louis XIV, that's Louis XIV, and Louis XV, Louis XV. This, too, was an era that Ludwig II knew well from books and from the theater. Here again, he began to order imitations of the stage sets and theatrical decor, which he knew from the theater to be recast in permanent stone. Thus was built the smallest of his castles, the only one finished during his lifetime and in which he regularly resided, Linderhof Castle. There were antecedents for Linderhof, namely the summer residences which the French kings had built in the park at Versailles. But Ludwig II's architects and stage designers were so masterful in their use of Baroque and Rococo styles that they didn't merely copy these earlier models. Instead, they created a building that also recalls Bavarian Rococo. Many art historians therefore praise Linderhof Castle as King Ludwig's most beautiful castle. Today, the castle's rooms are even more beautiful than they were in Ludwig's time. In accord with then prevailing tastes, the opulent murals and wall decorations weren't enough. These rooms were also crowded with countless other objects: furniture, sculptures, lamps, clocks, vases, knickknacks, and bric-a-brac of every description. For Ludwig, the gleaming gold and glorious pomp of the Rococo style recalled the good old days, the golden days. Just as today we sometimes flee from a dreary present into a 19th century which we imagine to be more beautiful, so too Ludwig II transported himself into the golden age of France's absolute monarchs. For him, Linderhof was the stage set in which he could indulge his dreams of life at the court of Louis XV. He tried to recreate everything that had played a role in this court, even, for example, the mechanical novelties. This is a magical, self-setting table. Food and drink were placed upon it by servants hidden one floor below. The fully set table then ascended for dinner, so that the noble guests could enjoy their meal without being disturbed by waiters or other servants. Similar mechanical furniture in many of Louis XV's castles had astonished the French monarch's guests. Ludwig II ordered a magic table like this for Schloss Linderhof, and was so pleased with it that he had another one installed at Herrenchiemsee, his third castle, later on. The king was almost always alone at Linderhof. His only companions were the figments of his imagination. We can get some idea what his imaginary world may have been like by studying the paintings that he commissioned and in which Ludwig's ideal world was depicted. These paintings reveal a society to which Ludwig himself would gladly have belonged. Men and women leading lives of utmost refinement, and well knowing how to enjoy those refined lives to the fullest extent imaginable. Marie Antoinette, the French queen who lost her life, and her head, on the guillotine, was one of Ludwig's special favorites. He regarded her as a martyr to absolute monarchy, and to the regal absolutism that died with her during the French Revolution. He commissioned life-sized portraits of several of the lords and ladies of the French court to be painted in the finest pastel techniques. He was able to have these noblemen and noblewomen, or rather their pictures, constantly present beside him. Beautiful ladies, elegant gentlemen like the young Duke of Saxony, or the king himself, Louis XV, and the elegant lady at his side, Madame Pompadour, wearing a close-fitting collar of her own invention, her fashion trademark. Ludwig II was familiar with the lives of these ladies and gentlemen from numerous theatrical plays. Time and time again, he commanded his court poet to write new plays, but always set at the court of Louis XV. He had one play about Madame Pompadour performed on 12 separate occasions, each time with a different actress playing the role of Madame Pompadour. He would sit all alone in his royal loge, every year on May 9th, 12 years in succession, the only spectator in the great empty theater. Theater was the most important stimulus to the king's imagination. Theater provided him with living images and characters to fill the many empty rooms in his castles. Originally, he had intended to erect a large Rococo theater at Linderhof, right beside the castle. But instead of that, he built just another piece of theatrical scenery. It was a tremendous rock grotto, which permitted him to turn away from the French king's court and be transported into the operatic world of Richard Wagner. Again, the transformation of a stage setting into real architecture. Again, the yearning for the perfect illusion. The Venus Grotto from the Opera Tannhäuser as an artificial limestone cave, complete with a lake and a waterfall. A stage setting as a place for the king to experience himself as part of the events on stage. A chance to be in the midst of the action. To float across the water on the love goddess's golden seashell boat. To indulge in the bacchanalia that the goddess and her entourage celebrated in honor of the Minnesinger Tannhäuser. Whenever Ludwig visited this grotto, the water had to be heated in advance to a temperature of 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Swans had to be swimming on the lake, and the light had to change color according to an established order, from red, the color of Venus, to blue, just like the Blue Grotto at Capri. As the king grew older, his architectural ambitions grew larger and more costly. Ludwig was very likely the most peculiar royal landlord that the world had ever seen. Like an invisible puppeteer, He directed a gigantic enterprise with thousands of employees, none of whom so much as even saw his face. He never spoke personally with the architects, painters, or sculptors who worked for him, preferring to deal with them exclusively through his secretaries and personal servants. In 1874, he once again visited Versailles, the predominant showplace of his dreams. To honor the visiting Bavarian king, Versailles' famous fountains were set in motion. The sight of them filled him with such enthusiasm that he decided to have them copied. But Ludwig didn't want to copy just the waterworks. He wanted to copy the rest of the castle, too. He had already toyed with a similar plan during the early years of his reign. Now was the time to finally fulfill his plans. Well hidden from the public eye, on an island in Chiemsee, the largest lake in the foothills of the Bavarian Alps. During Ludwig's lifetime, the Palace of Versailles had long since lost the appearance it had once had during the days of the Sun King. Versailles had been partly redesigned and was completely emptied of its furniture. Ludwig, however, dreamed of recreating the Sun King's original palace in all its 17th century glory. And because he was vain enough to imagine himself, at least in his dreams, as a truly great king, Ludwig wanted his copy to be a little bit larger and a touch more splendid than the original French castle. One of the rooms which no longer existed in Versailles itself was the so-called envoy's staircase. This staircase had served as the official access to the castle's upper story. Its purpose had been to duly impress the Sun King's visitors with its magnificence, thus preparing the king's guests for the greatest event of all, an audience with the king. The envoy's staircase at Versailles was even furnished with a bust of the Sun King, a bust which visitors were required to greet upon arrival. At Herrenchiemsee, on the other hand, no guests were expected except the king, Ludwig II himself. For this reason, statues of Greek gods were installed there to receive the king upon his arrival. Whenever Ludwig II visited his palace, the envoy's staircase was additionally strewn with thousands of roses and lilies. He visited Herrenchiemsee 5 times during the last 5 years of his life, always at the beginning of October, and each visit lasted a mere 10 days. The palace at Versailles contained a series of rooms in its central part, which, though they gave the impression of a royal dwelling, were not intended to be lived in, but were meant only for show. These were the so-called chambres de parade, the showpiece rooms. All of the Baroque era's monarchs imitated this custom, so Ludwig II decided to follow this example as well. His own private rooms are located in a side wing at Herrenchiemsee. The central section of the palace was reserved for the showpiece rooms, which were dedicated to Louis XIV. And the center of attention was the bedroom. It is the most splendid and most expensively furnished room ever commissioned by the king. what was it that so fascinated him about Louis XIV, the Sun King, who had ascended to the zenith of absolute power? Ludwig II was more than a head taller than the Sun King, but was terribly inferior to him in stature. Ludwig would have fit well in this splendid chair at the desk in the study in the showpiece wing, but he would never have been able to fill it out. He was lacking in all the prerequisites required by an absolute monarch. Though he admired the Sun King and the abundance of his power, Ludwig himself was completely incapable of wielding actual power. But when we consider the paintings in his castle at Herrenchiemsee, it becomes clear that Ludwig admired something else in this Sun King, something other than his abundant power. Ludwig admired the French monarch's scintillating vitality, his charm, his ability to be the radiant center of attention of a crowded court, to embody the shining example of a court society which marveled at his morning toilet as if they were beholding the sunrise itself. Ludwig II possessed an entire library of books about the Sun King and knew all the details of the king's life. Ludwig knew which artists had entertained the royal court with a never-ending series of parades, theatrical plays, fireworks, operas, and masquerades. Ludwig ordered his own royal theater to perform all the plays which had been performed at the court of the Sun King, and he commissioned his court painters to paint every major scene from the Sun King's life. For example, the reception of a delegation from Siam, famous because Louis XIV wore a magnificent diamond-studded robe worth more than 12 million gold pieces. Friendly delegations were received in the Hall of Peace. Enemy delegations were received in the Hall of War. Both of these halls flanked the large mirrored gallery that formed the palace's other centerpiece, along with the showpiece bedroom, of course. Ludwig II wanted his own mirrored gallery to be precisely like the one at Versailles. All the ceiling paintings were to be copied exactly. All furnishings meticulously reconstructed according to original models. But here too, Ludwig ordered everything built a little bit bigger and furnished a little bit more magnificently than the original models actually specified. At Versailles, the grand mirrored gallery was the showcase for a never-ending series of parties and festivities. A gigantic stage crowded with the elite of an entire country, all of them eager to bask in the radiance of the Sun King. This, too, is captured in many paintings at Herrenchiemsee. Ludwig II was familiar with all of the festivals at which court society had entertained itself. Masked balls and evenings of games and gambling attended by thousands of people. He had a very clear image of just how lively the Sun King's Versailles must have been, and he surrounded himself with depictions of it. Yet this was perhaps the greatest tragedy in his life. The disparity between the scenes of his imagination and those of his actual existence. Between this Sun King, who transformed even his evening toilet into a public appearance before a large audience, and the loneliness of Ludwig's own bedroom at Herrenchiemsee. At the foot of his bed stood a blue lamp, which helped him cope with his fear of the dark, an anxiety that remained with him throughout his life and continued to rob him of his sleep at age 40. At the head of his bed, an ice-cold Venus. His only companions, lifeless marble busts of the lords and ladies of Versailles, whose lives he so gladly would have shared. Subsequent gossip-hungry generations intimated that he had had love affairs with grooms and with youthful cavalry officers. There can be no doubt that he did have a fondness for men, but all historians who have had access to his strictly classified private diaries agree that he never succumbed to this affection for the male sex. Homosexuality would have been irreconcilable with his image of himself as king. It wouldn't have fit the role that he played for himself. He remained alone, terribly alone, all his life. He once had himself painted in the pose of his grand role model. Yet this portrait doesn't depict a genuinely great king, but merely an actor playing the role of a great king. Even the sovereign robes he wore were nothing but a theatrical costume. It's no wonder, then, that filmmakers, the preeminent illusionists of our own times, were so fascinated by Ludwig, the great illusionist. The most lavish film about Ludwig II to date was made in 1972 by the Italian director Visconti. In one scene, actress Romy Schneider, as the Austrian Empress Elizabeth, visits Herrenchiemsee Castle with a lady of her court. The scene is historically incorrect. Though Ludwig had in fact invited his cousin Sissi to visit him at Herrenchiemsee, she never came. Nonetheless, it is precisely this scene which best illustrates the almost unbelievable absurdity of this monumental architectural excrescence. The grotesque disparity between the gargantuan extravagance of the castle compared to the petty purpose it served. Once a year, for a mere 10 days, to be a theatrical stage set, a backdrop for the fantasies of a lonely, isolated king. In the final years of his life, the king's passion for new construction projects had become a consuming addiction. Although each year Ludwig could do as he pleased, with more than 70 million present-day dollars, this was nowhere near enough money for him. By the last year of his life, he had incurred massive debts totaling more than $300 million by today's reckoning. Although he hovered on the verge of bankruptcy, Ludwig wanted to continue building, and even went so far as to order the construction of 3 new castles. Up until that point, the government had more or less allowed him to build whatever he pleased. But now the government was suddenly eager to get rid of him. As a big spender, a debt-making spendthrift, Ludwig had become unbearable, both to his noble peers and to his country's economy-minded middle class. In those years, it wasn't easy to dethrone a reigning king, but it was possible if one could prove that he was of unsound mind. This was the course of action which the government chose. A commission of experts was appointed. Basing their remote diagnosis on eyewitness reports, the commission declared the king insane and recommended that he be committed to an asylum. The commission's leader, a renowned psychiatrist, together with a few governmental officials and several mental health orderlies, consequently departed for Neuschwanstein to notify the king that he had been dethroned and to take him into safekeeping. Film director William Dietela, who later enjoyed a successful career in Hollywood, restaged this scene in a silent film that he made in 1929. Relying on information provided by eyewitnesses, Dietela was able to accurately recreate the events of that fateful day. This was the first major film ever made about Ludwig II, and William Dietela not only directed it, but also starred, acting the principal role in that film. After being taken into custody, the deposed king was brought to one of his favorite castles, little Schloss Berg, on the shore of Lake Starnberg, south of Munich. This castle had already been prepared for the patient and converted into a sort of private and closed asylum. Ludwig was kept under constant observation and compelled to observe regular meal times and sleeping hours. The situation must have been unbearable for a man who had become extremely withdrawn and who was accustomed to living a solitary and nocturnal existence. He sought help from a male nurse and from an assistant doctor, but was turned away. It must have been devastating for him to realize that his commands had suddenly lost all their power, and that he was now entirely at the mercy of his doctors and nurses. Nevertheless, his outward manner remained surprisingly composed, so much so that by his second day at Schloss Berg, Ludwig's psychiatrist was convinced that his patient was now safely in the palm of his hand. On the evening of this second day, the doctor accompanied his patient for a stroll through the castle's park. He decided to do without an escort, no nurses, no guards, and set off alone with the king. One can only guess about the events that ensued. Hours later, after a hectic nighttime search, both men's bodies were found floating in the lake. Footprints were discovered in the muddy lake bed, which led to various and conflicting conclusions. William Dietela's film presents the official version. The king attempts either to escape or to kill himself. The doctor tries to stop him and is killed in the process. The king dies of heart failure, delivered from his misfortune by a merciful God. The official explanation of the king's death has been called into question time and time again. Every imaginable speculation has arisen in the century which has passed since Ludwig's death. Thus far, no compelling proof for any of these alternate theories has been forthcoming. But that doesn't really matter anyway. When a fairy tale king dies under mysterious circumstances, no one is interested in prosaic explanations. We prefer things to remain enigmatic and continue to believe in the legend of the good king and his evil ministers. But was Ludwig II really a good king? Whatever he was, Ludwig II was undoubtedly an extraordinary king. He was definitely not insane, as his contemporary psychiatrists and physicians had assumed, although his behavior was severely disturbed and his life tormented by a multitude of phobias and anxieties. Surely he was not an exemplary king, but compared with others, he was really rather lovable. All kings have spent enormous amounts of their subjects' money. Most of them wasted it on senseless, endless wars. Ludwig II spent it on castles, and in doing so, he left us a legacy which still excites our imaginations today. What more can we expect from a king? Incidentally, one of the 3 mountain-climbing roofers plunged to his death while working on Neuschwanstein's new roof. Beauty and tragedy often walk hand in hand.